Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet hour, this small space set apart from everything the day has asked of you. Wherever you're right now, whatever the day held, it's enough simply to be here. Perhaps you're in a dim room, covers pulled close, the sounds of the house settling around you. Perhaps the world outside is still making its small noises, and you're letting them grow distant. Whatever you carry today, you don't have to carry it any further tonight. Let it rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath come a little slower, a little deeper, and with each slow breath, feel the day loosening its hold. There's something about the nighttime hours that has always drawn people toward the oldest stories. The darkness quiets the ordinary world. And in that quiet, something older and larger becomes audible again. Tonight we enter one of those ancient texts, one that has traveled across 2,000 years of human longing to find you here, in this room, in this hour. It's the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, the last written of the four accounts of Jesus' life. And it's unlike the others in ways that matter for a night like this. Matthew and Mark and Luke concern themselves with events, with movements and miracles and the geography of a life. John concerns himself with something else entirely. He wants to reach beneath the events, to press his hand against the pulse of what it all means, to ask not only what happened but what it always was, what it will always be. John's Gospel doesn't begin with a birth in Bethlehem or a genealogy of names. It begins before all of that. It begins in a place before place, in a time before time, with a word spoken into silence that still hasn't finished echoing. So settle in now. Close your eyes if they aren't already closed. Let the words be like a hand resting gently on the surface of the night, steady and unhurried. There's nowhere else to be. The day is finished. The story is here. So let the night hold you, and let's begin at the very beginning, before the world was made, before the first light broke over the first morning, before the first river ran down to the first sea. Before the stars were set in their courses, before the first creature opened its eyes to the first morning, there was the Word. This is how John begins, not with a birth, not with a genealogy tracing names through generations, not with angels appearing to frighten shepherds in a field. John begins before all of that. He begins before everything. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. 3 statements, each one settling a little deeper than the last, like stones dropping slowly through still water. The Word was present at the origin of all things, not created at that moment, not called into being alongside the light and the sky and the sea. The Word was already there, already with God. Already in some mystery that language can only gesture toward, already being God. Take a slow breath. Let that rest with you for a moment. John is writing something different from the other gospel accounts. He's reaching further back, past the manger and the angels and the census, past the lineage of Abraham, past even the beginning of Israel's story. He's reaching all the way back to before time had a name for itself, and he calls this eternal presence the Word. The Greek behind that translation is logos, a term that carried enormous weight in the ancient world, meaning reason, meaning order, meaning the principle by which all things hold together. John takes that weighty word and fills it with something even greater. The Logos isn't an abstract principle. The Logos is a person. The Logos is in relationship. The Word was with God, which is to say there was closeness, there was face-to-face intimacy. There was something like a conversation happening at the heart of eternity before the first syllable of creation was spoken. All things were made through him. John is careful here. Not some things, not the beautiful things or the vast things. All things. Everything that has ever existed came into being through the Word, and not one single thing that exists came into being apart from him. Which means that every galaxy pinwheeling slowly through the dark, every river running down to every sea, every small creature that opened its eyes to its first morning, all of it passed through him. All of it was made through him, carried his mark, bore some trace of his nature, and in him was life. This is the second great movement of the prologue. Not only is the Word the source of all created things, but the Word is the source of life itself, of the animating force that turns matter into something breathing, something reaching toward the light. And that life was the light of men. Light and life, held together, inseparable. The same Word who called the first light into being out of the first darkness is also the light that illumines human beings, the light that makes understanding possible, the light that conscience and longing, and the aching sense that something true exists beyond what the eye can see, all of that pointing toward the same source. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness hasn't overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness, to bear witness about the light, so that everyone through him might believe. He himself wasn't the light. He came only to point to it. This distinction matters to John, and he returns to it twice in just a few verses. John the Baptist was a remarkable figure, a voice crying in the wilderness. A prophet whose fame had spread wide enough that people were traveling out into the desert to hear him. But whatever light people saw gathered around him, that light wasn't his. He was the lamp set in the window to help travelers find the house. He wasn't the fire. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. And then John writes the sentence that the entire prologue has been building toward. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Something ancient beyond reckoning chose to become small. The one through whom all things were made chose to enter the world through a particular door, in a particular place, in a particular body. He didn't arrive at a distance. He didn't communicate from outside the boundaries of human experience. He moved in. He set up his dwelling in the middle of ordinary life, among tired people in a dusty province of an occupied land, people who mostly didn't recognize him. The world was made through him, and the world didn't know him. He came to his own, and his own people didn't receive him. But to those who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, not children of human will or human effort, children born of God. And we've seen his glory, John says, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Moses brought the law, and the law was holy and right and good. But grace and truth came through Jesus. The law named what was right. Grace made a way through what was broken. These aren't opposites, they're a sequence. What the law pointed toward, grace fulfilled. No one had ever seen God, John tells us, but the one who came from the Father's own heart. He made God known. There was a man sent from God, and his name was John, and he had been living in the wilderness a long time before any of this began. He wasn't a scholar with a city address and a reputation built in polished rooms. He was a man who had gone out into the dry and open places, the places where the wind comes across the land without anything to slow it, and he had been there long enough that the wilderness had become simply where he was. He wore rough clothing, he ate what the land offered, and he preached a baptism of repentance to whoever would come out to hear him, which, remarkably, was a great many people. Word had spread. Word always spreads when something true is being said, and the religious authorities in Jerusalem heard it too, and they sent priests and Levites out to find John and ask him directly, "Who are you?" It's a reasonable question. The people were waiting. They had been waiting a long time. And whenever someone appeared in the wilderness with fire in their voice and crowds gathering around them, the same question rose up from the depths of that long waiting. Is this the one? Is this finally the one? John understood the question beneath the question, and he didn't hesitate. He wasn't the Messiah. He said so plainly without any shadow of ambiguity. So the priests pressed further. Are you Elijah? No. Are you the prophet? No. Then who are you? What do you say about yourself? And John answered them with a line borrowed from the prophet Isaiah, a line that had been waiting centuries to be claimed. I am a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. That was all. Not a title, not a throne, not even a name really, just a function, just a sound made in an empty place to prepare the ground for someone else. There's a kind of deep humility in that, to know exactly what you're and what you aren't, and to be entirely at peace with the difference. The priests asked why he was baptizing, then if he was none of these things. And John told them that among them already stood one they didn't recognize, one who was coming after him, whose sandals John wasn't worthy to untie. The next day, something shifted. Jesus came walking toward John, and John saw him coming, and something opened in John, some recognition that must have been building a long time, and he said it, simply and quietly. Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. Let those words rest for a moment. The Lamb of God. It's an ancient image, and John reached for it without elaboration, as though the image itself was enough, as though anyone with ears to hear would feel the weight of it settling into place. The sacrificial lamb of Passover, the lamb of Isaiah's servant song, led silent to the slaughter. All of that history, all of that longing, gathered into one gesture as Jesus walked across the open ground. John told the people around him, "This is the one I meant when I said, 'There is one coming after me who ranks before me, because he was before me.'" And then he told them what he had seen at the baptism, the Spirit descending like a dove and resting on Jesus, and the voice that came from somewhere beyond the visible world. "He's the one," John said. "I have seen it, and I bear witness to it." The day after that, John was standing again with two of his disciples, and Jesus walked by. And John said it again, quietly, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say it, and they left John and followed Jesus. It's worth pausing on that moment. John had gathered these men around him, had shaped them, had pointed them towards something he couldn't fully name, and now he named it, and they walked away from him toward it. He let them go. That too is a kind of grace. Jesus heard them following and turned around. "What are you looking for?" he asked. It's a gentle question, but it reaches deep. They didn't quite know how to answer. They called him Rabbi and asked where he was staying. "Come and see," he told them. So they went and stayed with him the rest of that day. The hour was about the 10th hour, John notes, which is late afternoon, the light going gold and long across the water. One of those two disciples was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And after spending that day with Jesus, Andrew went and found his brother and told him, "We found him, the Messiah." And he brought Simon to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You'll be called Cephas," which means Peter, the rock, just like that. No ceremony, no long evaluation, just a look and a name and a new thing begun. The next day Jesus found Philip, who was from the same town as Andrew and Peter, a place called Bethsaida. "Follow me," Jesus said, and Philip did. Philip found Nathanael and told him what he'd found. Nathanael wasn't immediately convinced. "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" he asked, with the mild skepticism of someone who knows his geography. Philip gave him the same answer Jesus had given the disciples. "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael was startled. "How do you know me?" he asked. Jesus told him he had seen him under the fig tree before Philip had ever called him. That was enough. Nathanael's skepticism dissolved all at once, replaced by something he hadn't quite expected to feel. "You are the Son of God," he said. "You're the King of Israel." "You'll see greater things than these," Jesus told him. And Nathanael had no answer for that, only wonder. On the third day there was a wedding in a small Galilean town called Cana, and the mother of Jesus was there. And Jesus and his disciples had been invited as well. Weddings in Galilee weren't brief affairs. They lasted for days, sometimes the better part of a week, and the whole village would be involved in the celebration. Neighbors coming and going, tables spread with whatever the family could provide, music drifting out into the warm evening air. It was the kind of gathering where everyone knew everyone, where children ran between the feet of the adults, where the oldest members of the community sat in the best seats and watched the youngest ones dance. It was ordinary life at its most festive, and Jesus was there in the middle of it, seated at the table with his friends, sharing in the meal. And somewhere in the middle of that celebration, the wine ran out. This wasn't a small embarrassment. In that culture, hospitality was a serious matter, and to run short of wine at your own wedding was a failure that people would remember and talk about. It would follow the family. It would cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful beginning. Mary noticed it first, or at least she was the one who said something. She came to Jesus and said only this, "They have no wine." That was all. She didn't ask him to do anything in particular. She simply named the need, the way a mother will sometimes bring a problem to a son she trusts completely, without spelling out what she expects him to do about it. Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour hasn't yet come." It's a strange response to us, and it would have sounded strange then too, carrying a weight and a distance that the moment didn't seem to call for. He was speaking about something larger than wine, something that hadn't arrived yet, a time and a purpose that existed beyond this courtyard and this particular evening. And yet Mary didn't argue with him. She didn't press him or explain her reasoning. She simply turned to the servants standing nearby and told them, "Do whatever he tells you." There's something very quiet and very confident in that instruction. She didn't know what he would do. She only knew that when he told them to do something, they should do it. That was the whole of her direction, and it was enough. 6 stone water jars stood nearby, the kind used for the Jewish rites of purification, each one enormous, capable of holding 20 or 30 gallons of water. They were practical objects, unremarkable, part of the everyday furniture of a Jewish household. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them, all the way to the brim. Then he said, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." And they did. The servants had drawn the water themselves. They knew what they had poured into those jars. They knew what they were carrying across the courtyard in that vessel. And yet when the master of the feast tasted it, he called the bridegroom over with a surprised and pleased expression and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have had plenty to drink, then they bring out the lesser wine. But you've kept the good wine until now." He had no idea where it came from. He was simply delighted by it, puzzled in a pleasant way, commenting on the generosity of the timing. The bridegroom probably didn't know what had happened either. The guests went on celebrating. The music continued. The evening deepened into night over the hills of Galilee, and the occasion that had nearly been shadowed by want simply continued on in quiet abundance. This was the first of the signs, and his disciples believed in him, and none of the other guests knew quite what had happened. Only the servants who had drawn the water knew. There was a man among the Pharisees named Nicodemus, and he came to Jesus one night, quietly, when the streets were empty and the city had grown still. He wasn't an ordinary man. Nicodemus held a position of real authority among his people, a ruler of the Jews, a member of the Sanhedrin, the council that governed religious life in Jerusalem. He had spent his life in the study of Scripture. He knew the law the way a man knows the rooms of the house he grew up in. Every corridor, every threshold, every stone worn smooth by years of careful attention. And yet something had brought him out into the dark streets that night, past the shuttered market stalls and the sleeping households, to find this teacher from Galilee. Something he couldn't quite name was pulling him forward. Why he came at night, John doesn't tell us directly. Perhaps he was cautious. A man in his position couldn't afford to be seen asking questions that might suggest uncertainty. Perhaps he simply wanted to speak without the crowd pressing in, without the noise and spectacle that seemed to follow Jesus wherever he went in those days. Whatever his reason, there's something tender about the image. A learned, powerful man making his way through the dark city because the questions had grown too large to carry alone. He found Jesus, and he began with respect. "Rabbi," he said, "we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." It was a generous opening, an acknowledgement from someone who didn't give such acknowledgments easily. He was saying, in the careful language of a scholar, "I see something real in you." Jesus didn't answer the compliment. He went somewhere else entirely, somewhere deeper and stranger than Nicodemus was prepared for. "Truly, truly, I say to you," Jesus told him, "unless one is born again, he can't see the kingdom of God." Nicodemus stopped. You can almost feel the pause in the room, the lamplight steady on both their faces, the city hushed outside. He turned the words over the way a man turns an unfamiliar object in his hands, trying to understand its shape. "How can a man be born when he is old?" he asked. "Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" It wasn't a foolish question. It was an honest one. Nicodemus was taking the words seriously, which is why they confused him so completely. He was a man who understood how things worked, how the world was ordered and governed, how human life moved from its beginning to its end. And what Jesus was describing didn't fit any of that. Jesus answered him gently. but without pulling back from the mystery. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he can't enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. The new birth he was speaking about wasn't a physical thing. It was something that happened in a deeper place, a place Nicodemus's learning couldn't quite reach on its own. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again, Jesus continued. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you don't know where it comes from or where it goes. So it's with everyone who is born of the Spirit. Think about what that image offers. On a still night, in a quiet room, two men speaking by lamplight. The wind that moves through the world without being seen, that bends the trees and stirs the dust, and then is gone. And no one can say exactly where it came from or where it has gone to. The Spirit moves like that. You can feel its effects. You can see what it does in a person's life, but you can't trace it back to a source, can't hold it still and examine it the way you'd examine a passage of text. How can these things be? Nicodemus asked. And there was no shame in the question. It was the honest response of a careful man encountering something that exceeded his careful categories. Jesus drew on something Nicodemus would have known, a story from the long wilderness wandering of Israel. Moses had lifted up a serpent on a pole, and whoever among the Israelites looked at it lived. The people had been bitten, suffering and dying in the desert, and the remedy was simply to look at the thing Moses had raised up before them. There was no logic to it by human reckoning. It was an act of faith directed towards something lifted up in plain sight. And so, Jesus told Nicodemus, the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. Then come the words that have been spoken in so many places, over so many centuries, that it's possible to hear them without really hearing them anymore. So let them settle here, slowly, in the quiet of this night, the way they settled in that lamplit room long ago. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shouldn't perish but have eternal life. Not judgment, not condemnation. Love. The kind of love that gives without holding back, that moves toward the world rather than away from it. God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, Jesus told Nicodemus, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Nicodemus didn't say much after that. John doesn't record any triumphant confession or neat resolution. The conversation simply deepens and then stills, the way a river widens and slows as it moves toward open ground. There's something right about that. The deepest conversations don't always end with conclusions. Sometimes they end with a person sitting quietly, holding something new and not quite sure of its full weight yet. The night air was still around them, and the lamp burned low. And somewhere in the city a dog barked once and then was quiet. The road through Samaria was long, and the sun was already high when Jesus sat down beside the well, tired from the morning's walking. The disciples had gone ahead into the nearby town of Sychar to buy food, and so he was alone. The well was an old one, dug by Jacob himself in the days of the patriarchs. Deep enough that you couldn't simply dip a hand in and draw up what you needed. The noon hour pressed down over the valley. There was no wind. The grasses along the path had gone pale and still in the heat, and the sky was the pale bright white that comes when the sun climbs to the center of everything and leaves no shadows anywhere. It carried within it the weight of generations of history. Men and women had drawn from it for centuries, their names now forgotten, their thirst now passed into memory. Yet it remained, a steady fixture in a changing landscape, still offering its cool depths to those who came seeking relief. It wasn't the usual hour for drawing water. Women came in the morning, or in the cooler late afternoon, when the air had started to soften and the day's work could be managed without suffering. But she came at noon. She came alone, carrying her jar, and the fact that she came at this hour and in this solitude is one of those details that the Gospel of John records without explanation, letting it settle quietly into the mind of the listener. There are reasons a woman might choose the empty hour. There are histories that make certain crowded hours difficult to endure. She carried hers without announcement. Jesus looked up when she arrived and asked her for a drink. This alone surprised her. She said so plainly, "You are a Jewish man and I am a Samaritan woman. How is it that you're asking me for a drink?" There was a long history buried in that question. Jews and Samaritans had no dealings with one another, as the text says simply. And this wasn't merely social custom, but something older and more complicated, a wound in the history of two peoples who shared ancestry and ancient memory, and had come to treat each other as strangers. She hadn't expected to be spoken to. She hadn't expected to be seen. Jesus answered her in a way she couldn't have anticipated. He told her that if she knew the gift of God, and who it was that was asking her for a drink, she would have asked him, and he would have given her living water. She heard this practically, the way any of us hear things when we're standing beside a deep well with a jar in our hands. She pointed out that he had nothing to draw with, and the well was deep. Where would he get this living water? Was he greater than their father Jacob, who gave them this well? The conversation deepened then, the way certain conversations do when one person begins speaking at a level the other hasn't quite reached yet, but can feel themselves moving toward. Jesus explained that whoever drinks from this well will be thirsty again. That's the nature of ordinary water, ordinary thirst, ordinary need. But whoever drinks from the water he would give will never be thirsty again. The water he gives becomes a spring inside a person, welling up to eternal life. It was a different kind of promise than she had ever heard, one that seemed to reach toward a hunger she herself carried but couldn't name. She asked him to give her this water so that she wouldn't be thirsty and wouldn't have to come all the way out here to draw. She was still reasoning about wells and jars and distance, and Jesus didn't correct her or explain further. He simply said, "Go call your husband and come back." She said she had no husband. And Jesus said, "That's true. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're with now isn't your husband. What you've said is accurate." She said, "Sir, I can see that you're a prophet." And then she asked him a theological question, the kind of question that lives close to the real one, that circles it before landing. Her people worshipped on this mountain, she said, but the Jews say Jerusalem is the place where one must worship. Where is the right place? These were ancient divisions between their peoples, lines drawn long ago and maintained with the care of those who had learned to live on opposite sides of a wound. It's a real question, but it's also the question of someone who has just been seen, who wants to understand the nature of this teacher before deciding what to do with what he's just said. Jesus answered her with something she hadn't heard before. He told her that the hour was coming, and in fact had already arrived, when true worshipers would worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. This isn't a matter of geography. It never was. The woman said she knew the Messiah was coming, the one called Christ, and that when he came he would explain everything. And Jesus said, quietly, plainly, as if it were the simplest statement in the world, I am he, the one speaking to you now. The disciples came back just then and found him talking with her. And the text notes that they were surprised, though none of them asked why. She left her water jar there beside the well and went back into the town, and many believed because of what she said. He told me everything I ever did. In Jerusalem there was a pool called Bethesda, near the sheep gate, and it had 5 covered colonnades, and under those colonnades lay a great number of people. They had been there a long time, many of them, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, those whose bodies had become a kind of long, slow waiting. The pool itself was still most of the time, its surface reflecting the colonnades above it, the stone arches, the pale Jerusalem sky. There was a belief, held quietly and persistently among the people who gathered there, that an angel would come at certain moments and stir the water, and that whoever stepped in first when the water moved would be made well. So they waited. Day after day, season after season, they lay on their mats beneath those 5 covered porches, and they watched the surface of the water, and they waited. It was a festival time when Jesus came up to Jerusalem, and he passed by this pool on his way through the city. The text doesn't tell us he was looking for anyone in particular. He simply came near, and what he found there was a multitude of suffering people lying in the shade of those colonnades, each one carrying a story the rest of the city had mostly learned not to see. The man had been ill for 38 years. 38 years. Let that number settle for a moment, the way a stone settles to the bottom of still water. 38 years of lying on a mat. 38 years of watching other people move through the city, carry their children, walk to the market, climb the temple steps. 38 years of watching the pool and hoping and being disappointed and hoping again with whatever hope still remained after so much disappointment. He wasn't young when Jesus found him. Whatever life he might have imagined for himself had long since been folded away. Jesus knew this. The text says simply that Jesus saw the man lying there and knew he had already been in this condition a long time. And then he asked him a question. It seems like a strange question, given everything. Do you want to be healed? It sounds almost unkind, until you sit with it for a moment. There's something gentle in the asking, something that refuses to assume, something that meets the man exactly where he is and waits for him to answer. Because 38 years is long enough for a person to make a kind of peace with their condition, to build an entire life around limitation, to stop reaching toward what seems impossible. Jesus doesn't walk past him, and he doesn't simply act without speaking. He asks. He makes room for the man's own voice in this moment. And the man's answer is honest in the way that exhausted people are honest. He doesn't say yes, not exactly. He says he has no one to put him into the pool when the water is stirred. And while he is making his way, someone else always steps in before him. He has been trying. He has been watching year after year, and every time the water moves, someone else gets there first. Someone with a person beside them. Someone with a hand to hold and a shoulder to lean on. He is alone. That is the heart of what he's saying. He has been alone in this for a very long time. Jesus doesn't respond to the logistics of the pool. He doesn't arrange for someone to carry the man to the water the next time it stirs. He speaks past the question entirely, past the system the man has been waiting to access for decades. And he says, "Get up, take up your mat and walk." And the man did. At once, John tells us. The illness that had held him for 38 years released its hold, and he took up his mat and he walked. The first steps must have been extraordinary, though the text moves past them without slowing. There's no description of the moment itself, only the fact of it, clean and quiet. He walked. He, who hadn't walked in 38 years, walked. Now it was the Sabbath when this happened, and the day of rest carried with it specific laws about what could and couldn't be done. And one of those laws concerned the carrying of burdens. The Jewish authorities who saw the man carrying his mat stopped him. They told him it wasn't lawful for him to carry his mat on the Sabbath. The man told them simply that the one who had healed him had told him to take it up and walk. They asked who it was. He didn't know. Jesus had moved away into the crowd before the man had learned his name. Later Jesus found him again, this time in the temple, and he said to him, "See, you have been made well. Don't sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." It's a quiet warning, its full meaning held beneath the surface of the words. And the man went away and told the authorities that it was Jesus who had made him well. The text records this plainly, without judgment. The man wasn't a villain for telling them. He had simply been found twice in one day by someone who saw him, and he didn't yet understand the weight of what had happened beside the water. But he was walking. After 38 years, he was walking through the streets of Jerusalem on a Sabbath afternoon, carrying his mat, while the city moved around him in its ordinary festival rhythm. Most of the people he passed had no idea. The colonnades by the pool were quiet again. The water was still. The man picked up his mat and walked, and it was the Sabbath. And the city went on around him without knowing what had just happened beside the still water. After this, Jesus went across the Sea of Galilee, which some also called the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd was following him because of the signs they had seen him doing among the sick. The sea was wide and the far shore was green, and the crowd didn't turn back. They had seen what he could do. They had seen the lame man walking away from Bethesda with his mat rolled under his arm. And word had spread the way word always spreads in a city where people are hungry for something they can't name. So they followed. Some went by boat. Some walked the long way around the northern edge of the water, through the reeds and the pale dust of the shoreline path. By the time Jesus reached the other side, they were already coming. A great multitude, John says, and he means it. Jesus went up on the mountain. This is a small detail worth sitting with for a moment. He didn't stay by the water's edge where the crowd could easily press in around him. He went up, and he sat down with his disciples, and the green slopes of that hillside stretched below them, and the sea lay still and bright beyond. It was near the time of Passover. The air would have carried something of that weight, that ancient memory of deliverance, of bread eaten in haste, of a people set free. And now here, on a green hillside above still water, another kind of feeding was drawing near, though no one understood that yet. Jesus lifted his eyes and saw the crowd coming. They were still at a distance, still winding up the hillside path, but there were so many of them. And he turned to Philip. Philip, who knew this region, who had grown up near here, whose practical mind John had already introduced us to. "Where are we to buy bread?" Jesus asked him, "so that these people may eat?" John tells us plainly that Jesus said this to test Philip, that he already knew what he was going to do. But the question was real in its own way. It was an invitation, a gentle pressure applied to a good man's assumptions about what's and isn't possible. Philip did what most of us would do. He calculated. 200 denarii, he said, would not be enough, not even if everyone received only a little. 200 denarii was roughly 8 months' wages for a working man. It was a serious sum. It was also, Philip was quietly saying, an impossible sum. They didn't have it, and even if they had, it wouldn't be enough. The math didn't work. The problem was too large. Philip had looked at the crowd, and looked at the resources, and arrived at the only conclusion the numbers permitted. It's a deeply human response, and there's no cruelty in it. He was being honest. He simply didn't yet know what honesty was standing next to. Andrew spoke then. Simon Peter's brother, always the one who brings someone to Jesus, always the one with that particular instinct for connection. He had found someone, a boy, somewhere in that crowd, a boy who had brought his own small lunch with him. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Barley bread was the bread of the poor. It wasn't fine wheat. It wasn't anything impressive. It was the bread a working family packed for a child heading out for the day. And Andrew, to his credit, brought the boy and the loaves and the fish forward. But even he heard how it sounded as he said it. "What are these?" he added, "for so many?" It's a question that contains its own answer, or seems to. What are 5 loaves for 5,000? Nothing. Barely a beginning. A gesture toward a problem far too large for gestures. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was much green grass in that place. John remembers this, the grass. That small sensory detail preserved across centuries. The soft, living green of that particular hillside on that particular evening. The people sat down. 5,000 men, John says, not counting women and children. The hillside would have been covered. A vast quiet settling, as if the mountain itself was being asked to hold still. Then Jesus took the loaves. He gave thanks. This is the word John uses. The same root that gives us the word Eucharist, the act of gratitude that precedes the giving. He held 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 small fish, and he gave thanks for them as if they were already enough, as if gratitude itself was the first step in the miracle. And then he distributed, to those seated on the hillside, as much as they wanted, not carefully rationed, not parceled out in small pieces with an anxious eye on the supply, as much as they wanted. The evening light would have been lowering by then, going golden and long across the water below. People ate. They passed bread to their neighbors. Children ate until they were full. And still there was more. The miracle didn't announce itself with sound or light. It simply quietly refused to stop. Bread kept coming from hands that had received it from hands that had received it from him. When everyone had eaten enough, Jesus said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, so that nothing is lost." And they gathered 12 baskets, one for each disciple who had sat down on that hillside with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and the impossible arithmetic of human need. 12 baskets full of broken pieces, more in the gathering than in the beginning. They gathered up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over from the 5 barley loaves, and the hillside was quiet again, and the sea below caught the last of the evening light. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. got into a boat, and started across to Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus hadn't yet come to them. The hillside behind them had grown quiet. The crowd that had eaten the bread and the fish had scattered into the evening, and the green grass where 5,000 people had sat was empty now, settling into the cool of the night. The disciples had come down to the water's edge as the last color left the sky, and the sea before them was already turning dark, that deep, uncertain dark that comes over open water when there's no moon and the wind begins to move. They pushed the boat out and climbed in, and the oars dipped into the water, and they began to row toward Capernaum, which lay on the far shore across the whole wide breadth of the sea. Jesus wasn't with them. He had gone up the mountain alone, as he sometimes did, to be in that quiet place where prayer goes deep and the world falls away. The disciples knew this. They'd seen him withdraw before, but knowing it and being on the water in the dark without him were two different things. The Sea of Galilee isn't a gentle body of water at night. It sits low in the land, surrounded by hills, and the wind comes down off those hills suddenly and without much warning. That night the wind rose, not violently, not all at once, but steadily, the way a storm announces itself by degrees. First a ripple, then a chop, then waves lifting and breaking against the hull of the boat. The darkness deepened as the wind increased. The disciples who were fishermen had been on this water in weather like this before, and they knew how to row, knew how to hold the bow into the waves, knew the particular exhaustion of pulling against a headwind in the dark. Their arms ached, the oars bit the water, and the wind pushed back, and they'd made perhaps 3 or 4 miles, somewhere in the middle of the sea, with the shore behind them lost in darkness, and the shore ahead of them not yet visible. Think about what it's to be in the middle of something, in the middle of open water, in the middle of the night, with the wind against you and the waves rising and the oars growing heavier with every stroke. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that. Not despair, perhaps, but a deep and pressing awareness of how small a boat is, how wide the water is, how dark the dark becomes when there's no light anywhere on the horizon. It was in that moment that they saw him, a figure moving across the water toward them, coming through the waves in the dark. It didn't make sense. A man doesn't walk on the sea. And so the first thing that rose in them wasn't recognition, but fear, that cold, sudden fear of something that falls outside every category the mind knows how to use. They were afraid, and then his voice came across the water to them. "It's I. Don't be afraid." That's all he said. 4 words, or something very close to 4 words, spoken across the dark and the wind and the distance between them. And something in those words was enough, not because the words themselves were elaborate, or because he offered an explanation of what was happening, or how. There was no explanation. There was only his voice, calm and recognizable in the middle of everything that was not calm, saying, "It is I, and do not be afraid." This is one of the oldest comforts in the world, the comfort of a known voice in the dark. The disciples had heard that voice teaching by the shore. They'd heard it at the wedding in Cana, at the well in Samaria, in the long evenings when the crowds had gone home and there were just a few of them together in the quiet. They knew that voice, and knowing it, something in them settled. They were willing to receive him into the boat. That's how John tells it, with a quiet simplicity that holds more than it says. They were willing. They reached out toward the figure on the water and they were willing to bring him in. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going, and the dark water was still, and the shore received them. There are crossings in this life that feel exactly like that. The ones you make in the dark, against the wind, not sure how far you've come or how far you still have to go. And sometimes, somewhere in the middle of those crossings, a voice comes through the dark that you know, and it says the same thing it has always said. It is I, do not be afraid. And the shore, somehow, is closer than you thought. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going, and the dark water was still, and the shore received them. The next morning the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there, and that Jesus hadn't entered it with his disciples, and they were puzzled. They had watched the evening come down. They had seen the disciples push off from the shore without him. They knew he hadn't gone with them, and yet here he was on the other side of the water, standing in the morning light at Capernaum, as though he had always been there. They didn't know about the dark crossing. They didn't know about the wind on the water or the figure moving over the waves in the night. They only knew that something had happened they couldn't account for, and so they came to him. They came across the sea in boats from Tiberias, and they found him, and they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" It's a simple question, a practical question, the kind of thing you'd ask anyone who had appeared somewhere they weren't expected to be. But Jesus didn't answer it. He heard what was beneath the question, the eagerness, the searching energy, the way this crowd had rowed across an entire sea just to find him again. And he named what he saw in them gently but plainly. "You seek me," he told them, "not because you saw signs, but because you ate the bread and were filled." There's something quietly searching in that observation. He wasn't accusing them. He wasn't turning them away. He was simply naming the truth of what had moved them across the water that morning. They had been fed. The hunger had gone from them, at least for a little while, and the one who had done that remarkable thing was worth following to the other shore. But Jesus was pointing towards something they hadn't quite seen yet. The bread on the hillside had been real bread. The fullness in their stomachs had been real fullness. And still it wasn't the deepest thing he had come to offer them. "Do not work for food that perishes," he said. "Work for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you." The crowd sat with that. You can imagine the morning around them, the light still soft off the water, the sound of the boat settling against the dock. And then someone asked the natural next question, the one that always follows when something is required. What must we do to be doing the works of God? It's a very human question. What's the task? What are the steps? What must be accomplished? The people who gathered around Jesus that morning were people who understood labor, who understood the rhythm of effort and reward, who had grown up inside a covenant tradition of commandments and practices and holy days, of things done and things avoided. If there were works of God to be done, they wanted to know what they were. "This is the work of God," Jesus told them, "that you believe in the one he has sent." One thing, not a list, not a system of practices or a hierarchy of obligations. Belief. Trust in the one standing before them. It's the kind of answer that sounds simple and opens into something vast the longer you consider it. For belief in this context wasn't merely intellectual assent, not simply the acknowledgement that something was true. It was a deeper alignment, a turning of the whole self toward the one sent from God. It was the kind of belief that changed how a person moved through the world, what they held precious, what they were willing to release. It demanded not just the mind but the heart, not just agreement but surrender. But the crowd wasn't quite ready to settle into that vastness. They pushed back gently, the way people do when something feels too large to hold. "What sign will you do," they asked, "so that we may see and believe?" "Our fathers ate manna in the wilderness. As it's written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Jesus received the comparison and then gently set it in a larger frame. "It wasn't Moses who gave your fathers the bread from heaven," he told them. "It was my Father, and the true bread from heaven is the bread that comes down and gives life to the world." The crowd heard that and leaned forward. "Sir, give us this bread always." And here is where Jesus said it plainly, the thing that would echo through the rest of that morning and far beyond it. "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me won't hunger. Whoever believes in me will never thirst." He said it quietly, the way the most important things are often said, not announced, not proclaimed from a high place with a voice meant to carry over hills, just spoken there by the water in the morning to a crowd of people who had rowed across a sea because they remembered the feeling of being fed. The simplicity of the statement masked its radical nature. He wasn't offering himself as a means to an end. He was offering himself as the end itself, the destination of all human longing, the answer to the restlessness that no ordinary satisfaction could quiet. The claim was staggering. He wasn't saying he could provide the bread. He wasn't saying he knew where the bread was. He was saying he was the bread, that the hunger the human heart carries, the deep persistent hunger that ordinary food never quite satisfies, could find its ending in him. That belief in him was the thing that could finally still that restless searching that moves through every human life. But he also saw what was happening in the crowd. He saw the puzzlement beginning to settle in, and he kept speaking, slowly, patiently, the way a teacher speaks when the lesson matters and can't be rushed. "All that the Father gives me will come to me," he said, "and whoever comes to me I will never cast out." The crowd began to murmur. These were people who knew him, or thought they did. They knew his father was Joseph. They knew where he'd come from. And now he was speaking about coming down from heaven, about a father who had sent him. "How can he say he came down from heaven?" they were asking one another. "We know this man." Jesus heard the murmuring. He didn't dismiss it. He addressed it directly, gently, but without retreating from what he'd said. "Don't murmur among yourselves," he told them. "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. It's written in the prophets, they'll all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father," he added quietly, "except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father." He was drawing a careful distinction, the kind that requires stillness to follow. He wasn't claiming what no human could claim. He was pointing to a particular and singular relationship, one that made him different in kind from the prophets and teachers they'd known before. The prophets had spoken what they received. He was speaking from what he had known directly, from a closeness to the source of all things that was its own category. And then he returned to the image that had begun it all. "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die." He let that sit. The contrast was plain. The manna had been miraculous. It had sustained a whole people across impossible terrain. And still, those who ate it had died. They had lived their full lives, and the manna had fed them through the wilderness, and then the wilderness had ended one way or another. What he was offering was something the manna had never been able to offer. Not sustenance for the journey through a particular wilderness. Life that the wilderness couldn't end. "I am the living bread," he said, "that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever." The crowd was quiet around him. The morning had deepened. The light on the water was fuller now, the kind of light that comes when the day has fully arrived and the softness of early morning has given way to something steadier. People were listening. Some were confused. Some were holding the words inside them the way you hold something you're not sure how to carry yet. And that was all right. Some words aren't meant to be understood all at once. Some words are meant to be carried a while, the way you carry a smooth stone in your pocket, turning it over slowly until your fingers know its shape. Little by little, the crowd began to thin. People drifted back toward their villages along the shore paths, talking quietly or not at all, each of them holding what they'd heard in their own way. The boats rocked gently at their moorings. The water lapped against the hulls in that slow, patient rhythm it had kept since long before any of them were born, and would keep long after. And by the water, as the afternoon light grew long and golden across the hills of Galilee, the disciples rested. They didn't understand everything they'd heard either, but they had stopped needing to. It was enough, for now, to be near him, to let the words settle where they would, the way bread rises slowly in a warm and quiet place. The story goes on from here. It always goes on. But for now, there's just the water, and the light, and the sound of the shore at rest. The Feast of Tabernacles was approaching. It was one of the 3 great pilgrimage feasts of Israel: the Harvest Festival, the Feast of Booths, when Jewish families across the land and across the diaspora made their way to Jerusalem, and camped in temporary shelters built from branches to remember the wilderness years, the long wandering, the tents of their ancestors under open sky. Jerusalem would be full. The roads would be crowded. Every family with the means to travel would be going. His brothers came to him and pressed him to go. "If you are doing these things," they said, "show yourself to the world. No one who wants to be known works in secret." There was an edge in the words. They didn't believe him. Not yet. Not fully. They wanted something they could point to, something public, something that would settle the question one way or the other. Show yourself. Go up to the feast and let them see what you can do. He told them his time hadn't yet come. Their time, he said, was always ready. The world had no reason to hate them. It hated him because he testified against it, because he said plainly that its works were evil. He wouldn't go up to the feast openly. Not yet. Not in the way they meant. So his brothers went ahead, and he stayed behind in Galilee. The roads emptied. The dust of 1,000 sandals settled. And then, quietly, without announcement, he went up to the feast too. Not openly, in secret. The text records it plainly. He went not publicly but in private, moving through the crowds the way water moves through stone, present without declaring itself. Jerusalem was already deep into the celebration when he arrived. The feast was halfway through, 4 days in of 7, and the city was alive with the sound of it. The streets were full of pilgrims. The booths rose from every rooftop and courtyard, their palm branches and myrtle woven together against the autumn sky. And in the temple courts, Among the merchants and the teachers and the men who had come from every corner of the Jewish world, there was already a question being passed quietly from person to person. Where is he? The chief priests and Pharisees had made it known that anyone who saw him should report his whereabouts. There was tension under the noise of the feast. People spoke in low voices, glancing around before they said the name. Some said he was a good man. Others said no, he deceives the people. But no one spoke of him openly. The fear was too close. The consequences were too uncertain. And then, in the middle of the feast, he appeared in the temple courts and began to teach. There was no announcement, no entrance designed to command attention. He was simply there, and he was speaking. And the words carried the kind of weight that draws people the way light draws moths, involuntarily, without their quite knowing why they've moved closer. The people who heard him were astonished. The question rose immediately among those who knew the schools of Jerusalem, who knew which rabbis sat under which teachers, who had studied where and under whom. How does this man know letters, having never studied? How does someone speak like this without having sat at the feet of the recognized teachers, without the proper formation, without the sanctioned credentials? He answered them directly. My teaching is not mine, he said. It comes from him who sent me. The claim wasn't a small one. He wasn't positioning himself within the existing tradition. He wasn't offering an interpretation among interpretations. He was saying something categorically different about the source of what he carried. The argument about the law of Moses moved through the crowd. He pointed to it directly. Why do you seek to kill me? The people pushed back. You have a demon, they said. Who is seeking to kill you? He spoke of the Sabbath. He spoke of judgment. He said, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. The words were simple, and they weren't simple at all. Some of them said, isn't this the man they are trying to kill? And yet here he is, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities have concluded he is the Christ? Others said, when the Christ comes, no one will know where he is from. We know where this man is from. He raised his voice. You know me, he said, and you know where I am from, and I haven't come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you don't know. I know him because I am from him and he sent me. They reached for him. Some of them tried to seize him right there in the temple courts, but no one laid hands on him. His hour hadn't yet come, and that fact hung in the air above the crowd, invisible and absolute. The temple courts hummed with the low murmur of people who didn't know what to do with what they had just heard. On the last day of the feast, the greatest day, when the priests had carried water from the pool of Siloam in a golden vessel and poured it out at the altar for 7 mornings, Jesus stood, and he raised his voice above the crowd. If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. The words cut through the noise of the feast, the way a single clear note cuts through a crowded room. People turned, people stopped. The ritual had just been completed, the water poured, the prayers spoken, the memory of Moses striking the rock in the wilderness honored once again as it had been honored for generations. And into that charged and sacred moment, into the breath that followed the ceremony, came this voice saying, "Whoever believes in me, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." It never did. That was one of the most consistent things about the way people encountered him. No one could agree on what they had just witnessed. Some standing near the front said he was the prophet, the one Moses had promised would come, the one Israel had been watching for across centuries of waiting. Others went further. "This is the Christ," they said, "the Messiah himself, the one the whole arc of their history had been bending toward." But others pushed back immediately. Could the Christ come from Galilee? The scriptures said the Christ would come from Bethlehem, from the line of David, from the city where David himself was born. They knew where this man was from. They knew his accent. Galilee wasn't Bethlehem. The geography seemed wrong, and so they dismissed the claim on those grounds, as if a birthplace were the whole measure of a man. What they didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that he had in fact been born in Bethlehem. The story had begun there, in the cold and the straw, and had moved north to Galilee the way so many stories move, quietly, without announcement, carried by ordinary people making ordinary decisions about where to live and how to survive. But none of that was visible to the people arguing in the crowd. They were working from what they could see. This is how it goes when the world tries to measure the divine with the instruments available to it. The instruments aren't wrong exactly. They simply weren't built for this. So division ran through the crowd like a crack through stone. Some wanted to seize him. Others said they would not lay hands on him. No one moved. No one acted. The moment held itself in a strange suspension, tension pulling in every direction at once. And yet the feast continued around it the way feasts do, the noise and the light and the smell of the city carrying on regardless. The chief priests and the Pharisees had sent officers to take him. This had been decided earlier in the week, when the debates in the temple courts had grown too loud to ignore. The order was clear: find him, bring him, enough. But the officers came back without him. The council looked at them. "Where is he? Why didn't you bring him?" "No one ever spoke like this man," the officers said. This wasn't the answer the council was looking for. The Pharisees answered with something close to contempt. Have any of the authorities believed in him? Have any of the Pharisees? No. This crowd, which does not know the law, they are accursed. The logic was straightforward to them. The educated had examined the evidence and found it wanting. The people pressing around him in the temple courts weren't equipped to judge. Their enthusiasm wasn't discernment. Their wonder wasn't knowledge. And then a voice came from within the council itself. Quiet, careful. Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? It was Nicodemus. He had come to Jesus once before, at night, years ago, with questions he hadn't known how to ask in daylight. He had heard enough then to make him cautious about the certainty his colleagues were performing now. He wasn't declaring himself. He wasn't defending Jesus openly. He was making a procedural point, the kind of point a careful man makes when he isn't yet ready to say what he actually believes. The response was swift. "Are you from Galilee too? Search the scriptures. No prophet comes from Galilee." It was a dismissal dressed as an argument. The question he raised was not answered. It was buried under the weight of reputation and assumption, and the particular impatience of powerful people who have already made up their minds. Nicodemus said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. Not there. Not that night, not in that room where the conclusion had preceded the conversation. Nicodemus walked home through the festival lights saying nothing, and no one noticed him go. At dawn he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and began teaching them. The morning was early still. The festival wasn't yet finished, and Jerusalem was full. People who had traveled days to be there, who had slept in booths and on rooftops and in the courtyards of distant relatives, gathered again as the light came up over the eastern walls. They came to hear him. That was the simple fact of it. Whatever the Pharisees thought of him, whatever the chief priests were planning, the people came, and he taught them. Then something interrupted the morning. The scribes and Pharisees came through the crowd with a woman between them. They had found her, or taken her, or arranged to find her. The text does not say. What the text says is that they set her in the middle of the people, in the middle of the teaching, in the middle of the morning. She stood there in whatever she had been wearing when they came for her, and the crowd went quiet, and every eye moved to her. They addressed Jesus directly. "Teacher," they said, "this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. The law of Moses commands that such women be stoned. What do you say?" The question was a trap, and they knew it. If he said stone her, he would be seen as hard, a man without mercy, someone who could be turned against the people who loved him. If he said release her, he could be accused of undermining Moses, of making light of the law, of teaching that obedience did not matter. They had constructed the question carefully. Either answer served their purposes. That was why they were asking. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger in the dust. They pressed him. They kept asking. And so he straightened up and he said, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he bent down again and wrote in the dust once more. There was a silence then that must have been difficult to stand inside. One by one, beginning with the eldest, they left. Not all at once, not in a group. One by one, each man finding his own reason to turn and go, until the crowd that had gathered to watch a confrontation found there was nothing left to watch. Just the woman. Just Jesus, still crouched over the dust. Just the morning, going on the way mornings do. He straightened. He looked at her. "Woman," he said, "where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And he said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." Why the writing? There's no answer that settles the question. Only the image remains. A man kneeling in the dirt of the most sacred courtyard in Israel, writing something with his finger, unhurried, while people around him waited to see whether he would sentence a woman to death. What arrived instead wasn't what anyone expected. That's almost always how it goes with him. Judgment was the frame. Grace was what came through it. She walked out of the temple into the morning light, and the city went on around her the way cities do, not knowing what had just happened in its midst. The great lampstands of the temple had burned through the night of the feast, 4 golden stands, each as tall as a man, their light visible from rooftops across the city, and it was in their shadow that Jesus spoke again. The treasury was a place of movement and commerce, of coins dropped into collection vessels, of quiet transactions between priests and worshippers. People passed through it the way people pass through any threshold that has become familiar, without ceremony, without pause. But the light from those great stands still lingered in the air, the memory of flame even now that the feast was drawing toward its close, and the crowd that gathered to hear him wasn't a small one. They pressed close in the way crowds do when something in them hasn't yet been satisfied. He said, "I am the light of the world." He didn't say it the way a teacher offers a proposition for discussion. He said it the way a man states something he has always known. "Whoever follows me won't walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The Pharisees heard this, And their objection came quickly, the way objections do when they've been prepared in advance. "You bear witness about yourself," they said. "Your testimony isn't true." This wasn't merely a theological complaint, it was a legal one. The law required two witnesses. A man who testified on his own behalf stood on uncertain ground, and they knew it, and they wanted him to know they knew it. He answered them with a patience that had no particular warmth in it. "Even if I do bear witness about myself," he said, "my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. And yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it isn't I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me." They pressed him. "Where is your Father?" "You know neither me nor my Father," he said. "If you knew me, you would know my Father also." He continued speaking to them. "I am going away," he said, "and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come." They turned this over among themselves. Does he mean to kill himself? Is that why he says, "Where I am going, you cannot come"? They were trying to locate him inside a framework they understood. He wasn't inside their framework. "You're from below," he told them. "I am from above. You're of this world. I am not of this world." Then he said something that changed the register entirely. "Before Abraham was," he said, "I am." There was no mistaking this. Abraham was the father of the nation, the anchor of their entire history, the man to whom God had made the first covenant. He had lived nearly 2,000 years before that moment in the treasury. And Jesus was not saying he had known Abraham, or that Abraham had foreseen him, though he said that too. He was saying something older than that, something that placed him outside the sequence of time altogether. "I am," not "I was," not "I existed before him." "I am." They understood it. That was the thing. They understood it precisely, which was why they reached for stones. To claim that name was to claim the name that had been spoken from the burning bush, the name God gave Moses when Moses asked what he should say. It wasn't a metaphor they were hearing. It wasn't a figure of speech. It was a claim so specific that it left no middle ground between worship and condemnation. They lifted the stones. He walked away. He passed through the middle of them and went on his way, and the stones they had lifted were still in their hands. As he walked along, he saw a man who had been blind from the day he was born, sitting in the place he always sat, at the edge of the road where the foot traffic was heaviest and the chances of charity were best. The disciples saw him too, and their first instinct wasn't compassion. It was a question. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This wasn't a cruel question. It was a reasonable one by the logic of their world. Suffering had causes. Blindness wasn't random. Somewhere behind every affliction, the thinking went, was a moral accounting, a debt being paid. The man sitting in the dust had been sitting there since before he could remember. He had never seen morning light on water. He had never seen his mother's face, and the disciples wanted to know whose fault it was. Jesus said it was neither. Not this man's sin, not his parents'. He was born blind so that the works of God might be displayed in him. This was a different kind of answer. It didn't trace the suffering backward to find blame. It traced it forward to find purpose. "We must do the works of him who sent me while it's day. Night is coming, when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." He had said it before, in the temple, in the long shadows of the great lampstands. He said it again here, on a dusty road, beside a man who had never seen light of any kind. Then he did something strange and quiet and unhurried. He spat on the ground. He made mud with the saliva and the dust. He spread it on the man's eyes with his hands, and he told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam wasn't far. It was where the priests had drawn water each morning of the feast, carrying it up to the altar in a golden vessel. The name itself meant sent. The man went. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what the mud was supposed to do, or who this person was, or whether this was the kind of thing he should trust. He simply went, the way people go when something in them already knows that an ordinary moment has become something else entirely. He washed. He came back seeing. What happened next had the quality of a stone dropped into still water, the rings spreading outward one after another. His neighbors stood and looked at him. They had seen this man every day for years, had walked past him, had perhaps dropped coins into his hand. Now they looked at his face and weren't sure. Is this the same man? Some said yes, others said no. It only looks like him. The man himself said plainly, I am the man. They asked how his eyes had been opened. He told them, a man called Jesus made mud and put it on my eyes and told me to wash, and I washed and I received my sight. Where is he? He said, I do not know. They brought him to the Pharisees. This was a Sabbath, which meant that the healing itself had become an additional problem, layered on top of the first. The Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. He told them the same thing he had told the neighbors: mud, water, the pool, and now he could see. The council divided. Some said this Jesus could not be from God, because he did not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? The question turned in circles without resolving. They asked the man himself, what do you say about him, since it was your eyes he opened? The man said, he is a prophet. This answer wasn't acceptable. Some of the Pharisees didn't believe he had been blind at all, so they sent for his parents. His parents came and answered carefully, the way people answer when they are afraid. We know this is our son. We know he was born blind, but how he now sees, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. The text records plainly why they said this. They were afraid of being put out of the synagogue, which wasn't simply a social consequence. It was the severing of a community, the loss of a world. So the man stood alone, his parents stepping back from him, and the council called him in a second time. Give glory to God, they said. We know that this man is a sinner. The man answered with something that had the sound of bedrock. Whether he is a sinner, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind, now I see. They pushed further. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And something had shifted in him by now. Some threshold had been crossed between the first interrogation and the second, because he pushed back. I have told you already, and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? They drove him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and he found him. This is worth holding. He found him. The man who had been born blind, who had been questioned and doubted and finally expelled, who had spent his whole life at the edge of a road waiting. Jesus came looking for him. He asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man asked, who is he that I may believe in him? Jesus said, you have seen him. It's he who is speaking to you. The man had been given his sight that morning. And now he was being given something else, something that doesn't come from mud or water or the pool of Siloam. He said, "Lord, I believe." The man who had been blind knelt down in the dust where he had spent so many years sitting, and he worshipped him. He spoke to them in a figure, the way he often did, letting the familiar carry the weight of the unfamiliar. The sheepfold at night, the gatekeeper, the shepherd who comes in through the door at first light and calls his sheep by name. The people listening to him knew sheepfolds. They knew the smell of them, the sound of them before dawn, the low, restless movement of animals waiting for the day to begin. They knew the way a shepherd's voice carried in the early morning air, and they knew that sheep, which seem to the outsider like animals without particular intelligence, can distinguish between the voice of the man who feeds them and the voice of a stranger. This wasn't poetry to them. It was fact, and Jesus used the fact the way a craftsman uses a familiar tool, picking it up without ceremony and putting it directly to work. The one who enters through the gate is the shepherd, he said. The gatekeeper opens for him. The sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and he leads them out. When he has brought them all out, he goes before them, and the sheep follow because they know his voice. A stranger they won't follow. A stranger's voice is wrong to them in a way they can't explain but don't need to. They simply turn away. They scatter. The people standing near him did not understand what he was saying. The image was clear enough, but the weight behind it wasn't landing where he intended it to land. What did sheep have to do with the healing they had just witnessed? What did a gatekeeper have to do with the man who had been blind since birth and now stood somewhere in the city seeing his own hands for the first time? They looked at one another. They waited for the meaning to surface, so he said it plainly. "Truly, truly," he told them, "I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. He will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." Then he went further. "I am the good shepherd," he said. "The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." This was the turn in the image that changed everything. A shepherd who tends sheep, who leads them out, who knows their names. This was recognizable, even admirable. But a shepherd who dies for the sheep was a different kind of statement entirely. No one hired to watch a flock dies for it. No reasonable man exchanges his life for an animal's. The economics of the thing made no sense. And that was the point. He drew the contrast slowly, the way a man who wants you to see something clearly moves the lamp close and holds it steady. The hired hand, he said, is not the shepherd. The sheep don't belong to him. When he sees the wolf coming, he leaves. He abandons the flock and runs because he is hired and the sheep aren't his own. And no hired man trades his safety for something that belongs to someone else. The wolf snatches the sheep. The wolf scatters them. The hired man is gone before it's over. But the good shepherd knows his own, and his own know him. The way the Father knows him, and he knows the Father, and he lays down his life for the sheep. He said more than this. He spoke of other sheep. Sheep not of this fold, sheep he must bring in as well, and the promise that there would be one flock and one shepherd. He spoke of laying his life down freely, of taking it up again, of a command received from his Father. "No one takes my life from me," he said. "I lay it down of my own accord." The crowd that had gathered around him was made up of people who had seen or heard about the man born blind. Some of them had been there when it happened. Some of them had heard it secondhand and come looking. They had been standing in the streets and the outer courts, following the argument from the healed man's neighborhood into the city, and now they were here, pressed together, listening to something that sounded simple and kept turning out not to be. The division began quietly, the way divisions always begin, not with a shout but with a murmur, with someone leaning toward his neighbor and saying what he was already thinking. He has a demon. He is out of his mind. Why are you listening to him? But others wouldn't have it. Can a demon open the eyes of a man born blind? Does a man with a demon speak like this? These aren't the words of someone the darkness has hold of. These aren't the words of a deceiver. Neither side could move the other. The question had no clean resolution, not because the evidence was thin, but because the evidence required a choice that not everyone was willing to make. To follow one answer all the way to its end meant arriving somewhere irreversible. The crowd divided again, the way it always did when he spoke, and the question passed from person to person like something none of them could quite put down. It was winter, and the Feast of the Dedication had come to Jerusalem, the feast that remembered the rededication of the temple in the days of the Maccabees, the 8-day festival of lights that burned through the coldest part of the year. The city was colder now than it had been at Tabernacles. The air had that particular winter clarity, sharp and still, the kind that makes distant things look closer than they're. Pilgrims still filled the streets, but differently than before, wrapped in heavier cloth, moving with purpose, not lingering. The temple courts were swept with a dry wind that came down off the hills and moved through the colonnades like something restless. Jesus walked in Solomon's porch. It was a covered walkway along the eastern wall of the temple, a long corridor of stone columns that offered shelter from the wind, where rabbis taught and people gathered, and the business of religion carried on at the edges of the sacred. He had been there before. People knew where to find him. "How long will you keep us in suspense?" they said. "If you're the Christ, tell us plainly." It wasn't an honest question. Honest questions leave room for an answer. This one was a demand dressed as a question, the kind designed to force a response that could then be used. They wanted a declaration they could act on. They wanted a word they could take to the authorities, clean and unambiguous, something that would settle the matter the way they wished it settled. Jesus didn't give them what they wanted, but he didn't evade them either. "I told you," he said, "and you do not believe. My sheep hear my voice," he said. "I know them, and they follow me." He had spoken of sheep before, just recently, in this same season, to some of these same people. The shepherd who enters through the gate, the voice the sheep recognize, the hired hand who runs when the wolf comes, and now here again, the same image, pressed further. "I give them eternal life," he said. "They'll never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand." Then he said the thing that changed the air entirely. "My Father and I are one." The silence that followed lasted only a moment. Then the sound of stones, people bending, reaching, the scrape of rock lifted from the ground. This was the second time. They had done this before, in the treasury, when he had said before, Abraham was, "I am." The stones were already a pattern. The response was becoming a ritual. He didn't run. He asked a question instead. "I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you stoning me?" "For blasphemy," they said, "because you, being a man, make yourself God." He answered them. He always answered them. He cited the law, the Psalms, the logic of their own tradition. If Scripture called men gods to whom the word of God came, how could they charge blasphemy against the one whom the Father had set apart and sent into the world? The argument wasn't evasion, it was precision. He was pressing them towards something they didn't want to see, and they knew it, and they tried to seize him. The river was cold at that time of year. The reeds along the bank stood pale and dry. It was quieter there than the city, the way open country is always quieter, the noise of human argument replaced by water and wind and distance. John had done no sign, people said when they came out to find him there. But everything John had said about this man was true. Beyond the Jordan, away from the city and its stones, many came to him, and many believed. A message came to him from Bethany, just a few miles outside Jerusalem, from the two sisters Mary and Martha, and the message was short and didn't need to be long. Lord, he whom you love is sick, and he did know. He heard the message, and he stayed where he was. 2 more days passed. This is one of those details in the text that's easy to read past and wrong to read past. He loved Martha. He loved her sister. He loved Lazarus. The text says so plainly, without ornament. And yet he waited. Why? Not from indifference. Not from delay in the ordinary sense. What was moving here wasn't indifference. It was something else entirely. A patience that operates on a different calendar than the one grief uses. He told his disciples plainly, "This illness doesn't lead to death. It's for the glory of God." And then he waited, and the hours passed, and in Bethany, Lazarus died. By the time Jesus and his disciples arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days is significant in ways that wouldn't have been lost on the people there. There was a belief, widespread among the people of that time and place, that the spirit of a person lingered near the body for 3 days after death, hoping to return, and that on the 4th day it finally departed. Whatever one made of that belief, the point was clear to everyone present. 4 days meant beyond question. 4 days meant finished. 4 days meant there was nothing left to hope for except the resurrection on the last day, which was true and real and also very far away. Martha heard that Jesus was coming and went out to meet him on the road before he reached the village. Mary stayed at the house, and Martha, when she reached him, said, "What grief says when it is also held on to something." She said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And then she said, without quite knowing why she was still saying it, "But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." He told her, "Your brother will rise again." She said, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." She said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." She said it the way a person says the truest thing they know, which is not always with full comprehension, but always with full weight. She went back and called Mary quietly, telling her the teacher was there and was asking for her. Mary rose immediately. The people who were in the house with her, comforting her, saw her get up quickly and go out, and they followed her, thinking she was going to the tomb to weep there. She went to where Jesus was, and when she saw him, she fell at his feet. She said the same thing her sister had said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." That was all she said. She was weeping. The people who had followed her were weeping. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and saw the crowd weeping with her, the text says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek word behind this is a strong word. It carries the sense of something stirred, agitated, shaken from within. This wasn't a composed and distant sorrow. This was grief meeting grief. This was the one who had made the world, standing inside the world's brokenness and feeling it. He asked where they had laid him. They said, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept. The people standing nearby said, "See how he loved him." Some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" It wasn't an unkind question. It was the question grief always asks, the one that has no easy answer on this side of things. They came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha said, and this is the humanity of it, the plain and honest humanity, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." She wasn't doubting. She was simply located in reality, in the reality of bodies and time and what 4 days means. Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" They took away the stone. Jesus lifted his eyes and prayed, not a long prayer, not a private one. He prayed aloud so that the people standing there could hear it and understand what was happening. He thanked his Father. He said he knew his Father always heard him. He said he was speaking for the sake of the crowd, so that they might believe. Then he called out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." Lazarus walked out of the dark, still bound in the grave clothes, and the people who had come to mourn stood very still. That same day, some of those who had been at the tomb went into the city and told the Pharisees what Jesus had done. And the chief priests and the Pharisees called a council. They had heard reports before, rumors carried in from the countryside, whispers about healings and crowds and a man who spoke in ways that troubled people long after they had stopped listening. But this was different. Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. There were witnesses by the dozens, people from Jerusalem itself, people who had come to mourn and instead had seen something they couldn't explain or contain or quietly dismiss. This wasn't a rumor. This was a fact that had legs, and it was already walking through the city. The question the council put to itself wasn't whether it had happened. The question was what to do about it. If they let him go on like this, everyone would believe in him. That was the fear spoken aloud in the room. And behind it was another fear, the one that lay beneath the first like stone beneath soil, that the Romans would come, would see a movement gathering around a single figure, would interpret it as the early current of uprising, and would act accordingly. They would take away the place. They would take away the nation. Everything the priests and the Pharisees had managed to preserve through decades of careful navigation would be swept away because of one man who wouldn't stop. It was Caiaphas who ended the deliberation. He was the high priest that year, and he spoke with the flat authority of someone who had already made up his mind before the discussion began. "You know nothing," he said. "You haven't considered that it's better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." He meant it as politics. He meant it as the cold arithmetic of governance, the kind of calculation that empires and councils and institutions have always made when the survival of the structure is set against the cost to any one person inside it. The math was simple. From that day, they made their plans to put him to death. Jesus didn't remain in Judea. He withdrew from Jerusalem with his disciples and went to a town called Ephraim, in the wilderness near the hill country, far from the feast crowds and the council chambers and the weight of the city pressing in. The text records this quietly, without elaboration. He went there. He stayed there with his disciples. That's all we're told. But there is something in that brief description worth holding. The wilderness, the stillness, the withdrawing. He wasn't hiding in fear. He was moving in the rhythm of his own understanding of time, which wasn't the same as theirs. His hour hadn't yet come. But it hadn't come. Passover was approaching. The great feast drew people from every direction, travelers arriving by the road over days and weeks before the festival itself, filling the city with noise and commerce and prayer and the smell of animals and dust and wood smoke. Jerusalem swelled this way every year. People came from far provinces, from towns along the Jordan, from settlements in the hill country, from places that kept the old faith quietly through the whole year and then sent their families up to the city for the feast. And this year they were asking about him. His name moved through the arriving crowds the way a question moves through a room when something has shifted and people sense it without yet being able to name what. The chief priests and Pharisees had already given their order. If anyone knew where he was, they were to report it so that he could be seized. That order was out there in the city, part of its texture now, woven into the feast preparations alongside the lamb and the unleavened bread and the bitter herbs of remembrance. Passover was near, and the pilgrims coming up to Jerusalem looked for him and said to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Will he come to the feast?" 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, the man he had raised from the dead, and they made him a supper there. It was a quiet house in a quiet village, and the evening had that particular quality of stillness that sometimes settles over a place when ordinary life and something larger than ordinary life occupy the same room at the same time. Martha was serving. She moved between the table and the kitchen the way she always did, attending to what needed attending to, making sure the lamps were full and the cups weren't empty. Lazarus reclined at the table with Jesus, close enough to speak, close enough to be seen. Not long ago he had been in a tomb. Now he was here, at supper, in the warm light, and the fact of that sat over everything in the room without anyone needing to say it. The guests would have been aware of him. It would have been difficult not to be. The chief priests, the text records, were already plotting to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus, because his presence alone was causing people to believe. A man who had been dead 4 days and then walked out of a tomb isn't easily explained away. He was evidence, living, breathing evidence, reaching for bread at the table. And then Mary came in with the ointment. It was nard, pure nard, the text says. And the detail matters because pure nard was not a common thing. It came from a plant grown in the mountain valleys of the Himalayas, carried by trade routes across enormous distances, and by the time it arrived in a village in Judea, it was worth what a laborer might earn in a full year of work. 300 denarii, Judas would say. He wasn't wrong about the value. A pound of it, sealed in an alabaster flask the way expensive things were kept, to preserve the fragrance and slow the loss. She broke it open and poured it over his feet. The smell reached every corner of the room before anyone had fully understood what was happening. Nard has a quality to it that is unlike ordinary perfume. Heavy and deep and sweet, not light, not fleeting. The kind of fragrance that does not lift off a surface quickly but sinks into it, settles into cloth and hair and wood. The whole house was filled, the text says. Not a corner or a table. The whole house. She wiped his feet with her hair. No one spoke for a moment. Then Judas Iscariot spoke. He was one of the 12, the one who kept the money bag. "Why," he said, "was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" The question sounded reasonable. It was framed as concern for the poor, and the text is careful to note what the frame was concealing. He was a thief, and what he handled, he took. But the question itself had a certain logic that the others at the table might have half agreed with in a different moment. 300 denarii wasn't nothing. People were hungry. The calculus wasn't entirely wrong. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Leave her alone. Let her keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you'll always have with you, but you won't always have me." 6 days before the Passover, the supper went on. The lamps burned. Martha served. Lazarus was at the table alive, and the smell of the nard was everywhere, saturating the air the way only the most concentrated things do, refusing to thin. The fragrance of the ointment stayed in the room long after the meal was finished, the way certain things do, settling into the walls and the fabric and the memory of everyone who had been there. The next day, the great crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, and they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him. He was coming from Bethany. The road descended from the Mount of Olives toward the city walls, and the crowd had gone out to line it, pressing close on both sides, laying branches in the path, lifting their voices. They had seen what he did to Lazarus. Word of it had spread through Jerusalem like water finding every crack in stone. The man who had called the dead out of the tomb was coming to the feast, and the people who had heard about it came out to see him, and the people who hadn't yet heard came out because the others were coming. And the crowd grew as crowds always do, each person carried forward by the movement of the whole. He found a young donkey and sat on it. This was how he entered, not on a war horse, not in armor, not with the bearing of a general returning from conquest. A young donkey, unbroken to this purpose, and he sat on it and came down the road toward the gate. The disciples didn't understand it then. The text says so plainly that only later, when the days ahead had done what they were going to do, would they look back and see the scripture it fulfilled. "Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." The prophet had written it. The moment had arrived, but the shape of fulfillment looked nothing like what triumph was supposed to look like. The Pharisees watched from where they stood and said to one another, "Look, the whole world has gone after him." There was frustration in it, and something that had moved past frustration into something colder. Everything they had tried to prevent was happening in full public view, in broad daylight, on the road into the city during the most attended feast of the year. The whole world. The phrase was an exaggeration born of desperation, but it felt true to them in that moment. And in a way, it was becoming true. Among those who had come up to Jerusalem to worship at the feast were some Greeks, Gentiles, not of Israel, who had made the long journey to the holy city and had heard what was happening. They came to Philip, one of the disciples, a man from Bethesda in Galilee, and they said simply, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip together went and told Jesus. The request itself was a kind of sign, the world reaching toward him, the edges of something much larger beginning to show. He heard it and he said, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." Not a refusal, not a deflection, a recognition. The hour had been coming for a long time, running beneath every conversation, every miracle, every withdrawal from crowds who wanted to make him a king by force. Now it had come, and what he said next was not what triumph sounds like. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it. Whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. He was telling them, in the language of seeds and soil, what the hour was going to require. Not the arrival of a conqueror, the descent of a seed into darkness, into breaking, into what looked like ending. His spirit was troubled. He said so. "What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." And then a sound came from the sky above them. The crowd heard it differently. Some said it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. The sound was real. What it carried divided them even as they stood together in the same road, under the same sky, in the same moment. He told them the voice had come for their sake, not his. Judgment was near. The ruler of this world would be cast out, and when he was lifted up from the earth, he would draw all people to himself. He said this, and they did not understand it, and they asked him about it. And the questions came, and the light was changing in the sky above the city, and the feast continued around them. The ancient rhythms of sacrifice and prayer and pilgrimage going on, even as something moved through the middle of it that the old categories could not hold. He withdrew from them. He went somewhere quiet. The crowd stayed where it was a while, and then in the way of crowds, it began to come apart, to dissolve into smaller groups, into families heading back toward the gates, into men debating what they'd heard, into women who would carry the memory of the branches and the voices and the strange sound from the sky down through years they hadn't yet lived. The road emptied slowly. The palm branches lay where they had fallen, already beginning to dry in the sun. The crowds had gone home by evening, back through the gates and down the roads, carrying what they had seen in the only way people ever carry such things, quietly and not yet knowing what it meant. Jerusalem at Passover was never truly quiet. The city held pilgrims from distant provinces, traders, priests moving through their appointed duties. The constant low sound of a people gathered around something ancient and serious. But even in all of that noise and motion, something had shifted. The day had the feeling of a hinge. Something had opened that couldn't be closed again. The people who had been there carried that feeling with them as they moved through the gates and down the narrow roads toward wherever they were staying for the night. Most of them didn't know what they had witnessed. They had seen a man enter the city on a young donkey with the crowd cutting branches and throwing garments in the road. They had heard the name of the Lord called out. Some of them had been asking questions since Lazarus, since the tomb opened and the dead man walked out still wrapped in burial cloth. The questions had only deepened. Who was this? What did it mean? What was coming? He didn't answer those questions directly. He rarely did. What he said instead pointed somewhere beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, toward something that would only make sense later, after everything had passed through what it had to pass through. The city settled into evening. The pilgrims returned to their fires and their conversations. The temple continued its work. The great machinery of the feast moved forward as it had for generations, as it would for generations more. Yet something was ending, quietly, without announcement. Somewhere in the city a room had been prepared. The 13 men made their way toward it as the evening light faded over Jerusalem. It was before the feast of the Passover, and he knew that his hour had come, that the time he had spoken about in veiled words and careful phrases was no longer approaching but here, present, unavoidable. The table was set. The men who had walked with him through Galilee and Judea and across the Jordan were gathered around it, reclining in the way of the feast, and supper was beginning, and the lamps were lit against the dark outside, and none of them knew what the night would hold. He knew. He had always known, and the text says something remarkable about what he did with that knowledge. It says he loved them to the end. He rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garment. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. He poured water into a basin, and then he began to wash his disciples' feet. Consider what it would have meant to watch this. The room would have gone very still. Conversation would have stopped. Men would have looked at one another and then back at him, not knowing where to rest their eyes. He was their teacher. He was the one they had followed from village to village. He was the one who had spoken with authority that confounded the scholars and silenced the accusers. And he was on his knees, with a towel around his waist, doing the work of the lowest servant in a household, the kind of work that no one of standing would do. He moved from one to the next. There was no speech, no explanation yet. Just the water and the towel and the quiet intimacy of the act itself. Feet that had walked the dusty roads of Palestine, feet that had walked beside him for 3 years, and he washed them one by one, and dried them, and moved to the next. When he came to Simon Peter, Peter wouldn't have it. "Do you wash my feet?" he said. The question carries everything in it. The protest of a man who understood enough to know that something was deeply out of order, who loved him enough to resist it. He said, "You shall never wash my feet." And there's something recognizable in that refusal. The instinct to decline a gift that feels too large, too unearned, too much. But he answered him plainly. "What I am doing you do not understand now," he said. "But afterward you will understand." Peter pressed further, and he answered again, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." And Peter, who was never one for half measures, swung immediately to the opposite extreme. "Not my feet only, but my hands and my head." The room was intimate enough that the others would have heard all of this. They were watching a man argue himself into surrender, and then past it. When he had washed all of them, he put his outer garment back on and returned to his place at the table. And then he spoke. "Do you know what I have done to you?" he asked. They called him teacher, they called him Lord, and they were right to do so. And yet he had washed their feet. He had given them an example. What he had done to them, they were to do to one another. This wasn't a lesson about hygiene. It wasn't a lesson about ceremony. It was something harder and simpler than either of those things. It was the shape of a life turned inside out, with greatness flowing downward instead of upward, with the one who held everything choosing to hold a basin and a towel. The world outside the room organized itself around other principles entirely. Power moved in one direction, service moved in another. What he had just done in that room refused that arrangement entirely. The hour was late. The city was quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the ancient feast was being observed in 10,000 households. The old story of deliverance rehearsed again as it had been rehearsed for generations. And in this room something was happening that the old categories couldn't quite contain. He sat back down, and the room was quiet, and the water in the basin was still, and no one said anything for a moment. and what had just happened settled over all of them like something they would be turning over for the rest of their lives. He was troubled in his spirit, and he said it plainly, "One of you will betray me." And the words fell into the room the way a stone falls into still water. And the disciples began looking at one another, uncertain, uneasy. The question passed between them without being spoken. Each man wondered, and in the wondering, each man looked inward at himself, at the parts of himself he wasn't entirely certain of. The room that had just held something tender now held something else. The basin was still there. The towel was still there. And yet the air had changed. One of them was reclining close to Jesus, the one he loved, and Simon Peter leaned across and asked him to find out who it was. "Who is it?" he asked quietly. Jesus answered that it was the one to whom he would give the piece of bread when he had dipped it. He dipped the bread. He gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. There's nothing in the text that makes this moment theatrical. No sudden darkening of the room. No dramatic pause. Just a piece of bread passed from one hand to another, the most ordinary of gestures made to carry the weight of everything. After Judas received the bread, Satan entered into him. The Gospel records this plainly, without elaboration. It doesn't explain the mechanics of it. It doesn't linger. It simply states what happened, in the same tone it uses to record everything else, and moves on. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do quickly." The others at the table didn't understand what he meant. Some of them thought he was being told to go and buy what was needed for the feast, or to give something to the poor because Judas kept the money. These were reasonable explanations. They were also entirely wrong. But the disciples didn't know what they didn't know, and the night hadn't yet shown them. Judas rose. He went out. And the text marks his departure with 3 words that carry more weight than almost anything else in the chapter. It says simply that when he had received the bread, he immediately went out. And then it says one more thing, not about where he went, not about what he was thinking, just a single fact, offered without comment, the way the gospel often offers the things that matter most. And it was night. Now, in the room, with the night outside and only these men left, he began to speak to them in a way he hadn't spoken before. Not in parables for crowds, not in debates with the learned, but quietly, directly, the way a man speaks to the people he loves when there isn't much time left. The city was somewhere beyond it, still moving through its ancient business of feast and prayer and pilgrimage, entirely unaware of what was being said in this particular room on this particular night. And what was being said was this, a new commandment he was giving them: love one another, not as a general principle, not as a religious obligation cataloged alongside the others, but in a specific and demanding way. "As I have loved you," he said, "so you also ought to love one another." The measure was him, everything they had watched him do, every person he had stopped for, every moment he had turned towards someone the world had turned away from. That was the measure. "By this," he told them, "all people will know that you're my disciples, if you've love for one another." It was a great deal to ask. They were quiet men in a quiet room, and the instruction was enormous. But he didn't pause long on it. There was more he needed to say, and the night wasn't endless. Simon Peter was the one who asked first. "Lord," he said, "where are you going?" The question was simple and urgent, the kind of question a person asks when they sense something is ending and can't quite name what it's. He spoke now. "Where are you going?" "Where I am going," he said, "You cannot follow me now, but you'll follow afterward." Peter pushed further. "Why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." There was something tender in the response that followed, something that didn't shame Peter for the claim but looked past it clearly. "Will you lay down your life for me?" he said. And then he told him what the night would bring. The 3 denials before the rooster called. None of them did, but the words settled into the room regardless, and the room held them. "Don't let your hearts be troubled," he told them then. He said it plainly, the way you say something you mean entirely. "You believe in God," he said. "Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it weren't so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, so that where I am you may also be." These weren't abstract promises delivered in formal language. They were the words of someone making arrangements, someone thinking about the people being left behind and wanting them to know they hadn't been forgotten, that the leaving wasn't abandonment but preparation, that the going was on their behalf. "You know the way to where I am going," he said. Thomas said what the others were thinking. "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way?" The answer came in 3 words joined together into something that has been carried across centuries, repeated in every language the world has ever spoken. "I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." It was an invitation. The answer was a person, standing in front of them, speaking to them by name. "If you had known me," he continued, "you would have known my Father also. From now on you do know him and have seen him." Philip asked then, the way people ask when they are close to understanding something but need one more step. "Lord, show us the Father, and it's enough for us." He answered Philip the way you answer someone who has been with you a long time and still has not quite seen what was in front of them the whole time, not with frustration, but with a kind of gentle wondering. "Have I been with you so long," he said, "and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." This was the claim at the center of everything. Not a claim about doctrine or authority in the conventional sense, but a claim about visibility, about what it means to look at one thing and see another, about the way the divine had chosen to make itself known, not in separateness and distance, not in the kind of overwhelming presence that leaves no room for a human being to remain standing, but in a face and a voice and a way of moving through the world that could be watched and followed and, eventually, remembered. "Do you not believe," he asked, "that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I don't speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works." The works themselves were evidence. Every healing, every feeding, every morning beside the water when the light came in low and he was already there waiting. All of it was testimony. He had shown them the Father, he said, not in the way they were looking for, not in thunder or spectacle, but in every word spoken and every hand laid on the sick and every morning beside the lake. And if they had been paying attention, they had already seen everything they needed to see. There was more he wanted to tell them, and so he continued, his voice steady in the lamplight, the city outside gone quiet around them. "The world couldn't receive this," he told them, not because the world was beyond reach, but because the world didn't know how to look for what couldn't be seen with ordinary eyes or measured by ordinary means. The world looked at surfaces. The world counted armies and weighed silver and built its certainties on things that could be touched and verified and possessed. What he was describing existed in a register the world hadn't learned to read. But they knew it. They had been living alongside it. They had, in some sense, already been shaped by it and would recognize it when it came. Because he lived, they would live also. The construction matters. Not they would survive, not they would continue, not they would endure. They would live, which in this gospel has always meant something larger than biological persistence. To live in the fullest sense was to be connected to the source of life itself, to abide in something that didn't end, to draw from a root that went deeper than circumstance. He was telling them that his life and their life weren't separate accounts, they were joined. What happened to one wasn't finally separable from what happened to the other. The room must have been very still by now. The supper was finished. The hour was late. Outside, Jerusalem was moving through the rhythms of the Passover feast, lamplight in windows, voices in the streets, the ancient business of a people remembering what God had done for them. And inside this room, something quieter and stranger was happening. A man preparing the people he loved for his absence by telling them they would never truly be without him. "Peace I leave with you," he said. "My peace I give to you." And then he said the important thing. He said it the way you say something when you want to make certain it has been heard. "Not as the world gives," he said, "do I give to you." The world's peace was conditional, contingent, available only when certain arrangements held and certain threats receded. It was the peace of enough bread today, of no enemies at the gate this morning, of nothing yet gone wrong. It depended on circumstances remaining favorable, and circumstances rarely did. What he was giving them was a different thing entirely. A peace that didn't require favorable circumstances. A peace that could exist inside grief, inside uncertainty, inside the kind of night that had no visible end. "Let not your heart be troubled," he said. And he said it again. "Neither let it be afraid." And the words were not a command so much as a gift, something to be carried, something to return to in the years ahead when the nights were long and the road was hard, and the peace felt very far away. He spoke of a vine, the way the roots go deep, and the branches reach out, and the life of the whole thing moves through everything at once, invisible, constant. The difference between a branch that bears fruit and one that withers. It was an image they would have understood without effort. Vines were everywhere in that land. They grew along the hillsides and the garden walls, and everyone knew what a healthy vine looked like and what a dead one looked like, and everyone knew that the branch doesn't decide on its own to bear fruit. The branch doesn't will itself into fruitfulness. It simply remains. It stays connected to the thing that gives it life, and the life moves through it, and fruit appears. That was the whole of it. That was the image he was offering them in the lamplight of that room, on the last night before everything changed. "I am the true vine," he said, "and my Father is the vine dresser. He tends it, he watches it, he removes what's dead, and he prunes what's living so that it can bear more. This isn't cruelty. Pruning looks like loss and isn't loss. It's the act of a vine dresser who understands what the vine is for and who cares enough to do the slow, patient work of shaping it toward abundance. Abide in me," he said, and then he said it again. The word in the original language carries the weight of remaining, of staying, of not leaving. It isn't an urgent word. It's a quiet word, a word that asks nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, only this: Stay. Remain in me as I remain in you. Let the connection hold. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Not little, not less, nothing. It was a plain statement, not a rebuke. A vine doesn't scold its branches for failing to produce fruit when they've been cut off. It simply observes what's true. Cut off from the source, nothing grows. Connected to it, everything becomes possible, and the fruit that comes isn't the branch's accomplishment, but the life of the vine expressing itself through the branch. He told them that if they remained in him, and his words remained in them, they could ask whatever they wished, and it would be done. This wasn't a formula. It was a description of what happens when a person is so fully connected to the vine that their desires begin to take the shape of the vine's own purpose. The asking and the giving become one thing. The will of the branch and the life of the vine move together. Then the command returned, the one he had given them earlier in the night, when the basin was still on the floor and the towel was set aside. Love one another, he said, as I have loved you. He gave it again here, not because they had forgotten, but because it needed to be said more than once. Some things do. Greater love has no one than this, he said, that someone laid down his life for his friends. He said it without ceremony. He said it as a man who had already made the decision and was not uncertain about it. And then he said something that must have taken them a moment to absorb. I don't call you servants any longer. A servant doesn't know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends. Everything I heard from my Father I have made known to you. This was the intimacy the whole evening had been building toward, the basin and the towel and the commandment and the promises all moving in this direction. Not obligation, not duty, friendship, the kind that shares what it knows, that brings you fully into what's happening rather than leaving you to guess. He knew the world wouldn't always receive them gently. He said so. If the world hates you, he said, know that it hated me before it hated you. But he said it the way a man says something true and necessary without meaning to frighten, grounding them in what was real without letting the weight of it overwhelm what else was real. You belong to something that outlasts the hatred. You bear fruit that remains. You were chosen for this. You did not choose me, he said. I chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that would last. And whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give it to you. They were going to weep and mourn, he told them. And he didn't pretend otherwise, didn't soften it into something easier to hear. But he also told them that the grief wouldn't stay. This is one of the things that makes these words so different from comfort offered carelessly. He didn't say you won't suffer. He didn't say the road ahead is easy or that the loss won't be real. He said the sorrow would come, and then he said it would turn. Not disappear, turn. The way a season turns, the way a night turns toward morning, not by the darkness vanishing all at once, but by light arriving anyway, gradually, until the dark is simply gone. He reached for an image that every person in that room would have understood without explanation. A woman in labor, he said, when the pain is at its worst, when the body is given over entirely to something that can't be stopped or reasoned with or hurried, in that hour she is in anguish. The world doesn't soften for her. Time doesn't slow. But when the child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because the joy has arrived, and the joy is larger than what preceded it. This was the shape he gave to what was coming. Not the removal of pain, the arrival of something that would make the pain small by comparison. The disciples didn't yet know what he meant. They were sitting in a room with him. He was still there. The loss he was describing hadn't yet happened, and the joy on the other side of it was entirely invisible to them. They were trying to follow his meaning and finding the path difficult. He knew this. He had been watching their faces all evening, answering questions they were afraid to ask directly, returning again and again to the same reassurances because the reassurances needed repeating. So he told them that a time was coming when they would ask him nothing, when they wouldn't need to pass their questions through him to reach the Father, because the Father himself loved them. This was its own kind of promise. Direct access, no intermediary. Ask, he said, and you will receive, that your joy may be full. The fullness was the point, not partial comfort, not managed grief. Full joy on the other side of sorrow, given by the Father in his name. He spoke plainly to them then, without figures of speech, without the layered language of parable. He said what he meant. I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I am leaving the world and going to the Father. They heard this and said, yes, now we understand. Now you are speaking plainly. They said they believed. And he looked at them with something that was not quite doubt and not quite tenderness, but held both at once. And he said the hour was coming when they would be scattered, each to his own home, and would leave him alone. Yet he wouldn't be alone, because the Father was with him. He told them all of this so they would have peace, not the peace of undisturbed circumstances, not the kind the world offers and then quietly withdraws. Something else, something that could survive the scattering, survive the grief, survive the hours ahead that none of them were ready for. I have said these things to you, he told them, that in me you may have peace, and in the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, he said, I have overcome the world. When he had finished speaking, he lifted up his eyes to heaven, and he prayed, and the disciples were there to hear it, which meant they were hearing something that wasn't meant to be overheard so much as witnessed. There's a difference between those two things. To overhear is to receive something that wasn't intended for you, to catch a fragment of a conversation meant for someone else. To witness is to be present at something that requires a witness, something that can't be fully itself unless it's seen and heard and held in memory. The disciples in that room were witnesses. They sat in the lamplight and they listened. And what they heard was a man speaking to his Father with the kind of directness and intimacy that can't be performed. It was too specific for that, too quiet, too particular in what it asked for. He spoke of eternal life, and he defined it in a way that was different from how it was usually understood. Eternal life, he said, was this: to know the Father, the only true God, and to know the one whom the Father had sent. Not a duration then, but a relationship. Not the extension of time, but the depth of knowing. The kind of knowing that changes a person from the inside out. The kind that has no end because the one being known has no end. Then he prayed for the disciples themselves, the men sitting in that room, the ones who had been with him and had heard everything and still understood only part of it. He had kept them, he said. He had guarded them. He wasn't asking the Father to take them out of the world, but to keep them from the evil within it. The distinction mattered. The world was where they would be sent. The world was where the work would happen. He wasn't praying for their removal, but for their protection, for something to surround them in the exposure ahead. He prayed that they would be sanctified in truth. He prayed that the joy he carried would be made full in them. These weren't small requests. They weren't the ordinary concerns of an ordinary evening. They were the deepest things he could ask for on their behalf, and he asked for them quietly, in a room, with the night outside and the city still moving at the edges of everything. He asked that the love with which the Father had loved him would be in them. That was the last thing he asked for. Not power, not success, not the protection of their bodies or the clarity of their minds. The love that had existed before the world began, before there was anything to love except the infinite mutual knowing of Father and Son. That love, he asked, should be in them. The prayer ended, and the night was still, and the room held for a moment the weight of everything he had asked for, and then they rose and went out. They crossed the Kidron Valley, and on the other side there was a garden. He and his disciples went into it. Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. The valley itself wasn't much, a narrow ravine between the city and the Mount of Olives, a place where water ran in the rainy season and dried to nothing in the heat. They would have crossed it in silence, or near silence, the prayer still settling over them. The words of it still present in the air the way the smell of incense lingers after the lamp has gone out. He had prayed that they might be one, that the love the Father had for him might be in them. Now they were walking in the dark beneath that same sky toward a garden they had visited before, a place of trees and familiar ground, and the kind of quiet that a city can't offer. There was no alarm in him. That's the thing the text makes clear. He knew what was coming, had known it long enough to speak of it plainly, long enough to prepare for it in prayer. Long enough that when the torches appeared at the edge of the garden, he didn't draw back or speak in a lowered voice or look for another way out. He walked toward them. The company that came was considerable. Soldiers, officers of the chief priests and Pharisees, Judas guiding them, and they carried lanterns and torches and weapons, the kind of preparation you make when you expect resistance. They were looking for a dangerous man, or at least they had been told to bring one back. They came with the force appropriate to that expectation. He asked them who they were looking for. Jesus of Nazareth, they said. I am he answered. Something in the saying of it, the simplicity or the certainty or something that words do not fully account for, moved through them like a wave. They drew back and fell to the ground. He asked them again. They answered again, and again he said, I am he. Then he said what he had already asked for in the prayer, that if it was him they wanted, his disciples should be let go. This is how he moves through the moment, not with resistance, not with negotiation, but with a kind of authority that arranges things according to what he has already asked for. Peter didn't accept it so easily. He had a sword and he used it. The servant of the high priest lost his right ear in the dark of the garden. A sharp moment of human panic in the middle of something that was moving far above such things. Jesus told him to put the sword away. The cup the Father has given me, he said. Shall I not drink it? Not a question, really. More like a fact stated in the shape of one. The ear was restored. The sword was sheathed. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. The garden returned to its strange calm, the torches burning, the soldiers standing, the night holding everything in place. They bound him then, and it was done. He was bound, and he was led away, and his disciples were let go into the dark, just as he had asked, and the garden was quiet again behind them. The trial didn't take long in the telling, though it took hours in the living, and through all of it he stood before Pilate with a stillness that confused the governor, who expected fear or argument and got neither. Pilate asked him where he was from, and he did not answer. He had already said what needed to be said. Earlier, when Pilate had asked if he was a king, he had answered carefully, speaking of a kingdom not of this world, speaking of truth. And Pilate had asked the question that has echoed down through centuries of philosophy and theology and human longing. What's truth? He asked it and then walked out, and the text does not record that he waited for an answer. What we know is that he found no guilt in him. He said so. He said it more than once. The crowd wanted Barabbas released. This was the custom, a prisoner freed at the feast. And the crowd chose Barabbas, and the choice is one of those moments in the narrative that carries its own weight without needing commentary. Pilate had him flogged. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him, and they said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. And then Pilate brought him out again and said to the crowd, "Behold the man." There's something in that phrase that the gospel preserves with great care. Behold the man. It was said mockingly, or dismissively, or perhaps with some strange unease that Pilate himself could not name. But the words are there, and they've meant different things to different people in every generation since. Behold the man, standing there in the crown of thorns and the purple robe, having said nothing in his own defense that could have saved him, having spoken only of truth and of a kingdom the world could not see. The crowd called for crucifixion. Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered that they had no king but Caesar. And at that, the text records simply, "He handed him over to be crucified." What followed is told in the Gospel with the same quiet economy that marks the whole of John's account. He carried his own cross. He went out to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is Golgotha, and there they crucified him. There were 2 others with him, one on either side, and he was in the middle. Pilate had written a title and fastened it to the cross, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." It was written in Aramaic, in Latin, in Greek, the 3 languages of that world, which meant that nearly anyone who passed could read it. "What I have written," he said, "I have written," and he didn't change it. The soldiers divided his garments among them, casting lots for his tunic, because the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom, and they didn't want to tear it. The text notes this as the fulfillment of a word spoken long before. His mother was there. She was standing near the cross, and with her was her sister and Mary Magdalene. The beloved disciple was standing there as well. When he saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, behold your son." And to the disciple he said, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. After this, knowing that all things were now finished, he said, "I thirst." They held a sponge soaked in sour wine up to his mouth on a hyssop branch, and when he had received it, he said, "It is finished," and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. That phrase, "He bowed his head and gave up his spirit," the distinction is one the gospel seems to intend. This wasn't defeat. It was completion, a task carried to its end, a word spoken in full, a thing done exactly as it was always going to be done. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. Joseph of Arimathea, a disciple who had kept that fact quiet out of fear, asked Pilate for the body. Pilate gave permission. Nicodemus came too. the man who had come to him by night long ago with his careful questions, and he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, and together they wrapped the body in linen cloths with the spices, according to the burial custom. There was a garden in the place where he was crucified. In the garden was a new tomb. They laid him in a garden tomb, in a new tomb where no one had yet been laid. And the stone was rolled across the entrance, and the Sabbath was coming, and for a little while the world was very quiet. On the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb. She had come alone, in that particular darkness that belongs to the hours just before the world remembers how to be light again. The city behind her was still. The road she had walked was empty. There was no one to witness what she found, which was the stone rolled away from the entrance, the tomb open, and everything it meant not yet legible to her in the dark. She didn't go in. She turned and ran. She ran to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She told them what she had seen, or rather what she hadn't seen, what was missing. What absence had replaced what should have been there. They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, she said. We don't know where they've laid him. The grief in those words is layered. Not only loss, but displacement. Not only death, but the taking away of the body. The last remaining place where grief could go and sit and be present to what it had lost. The two men ran. The other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen cloths lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived. He went in, and he saw the linen cloths, and he saw the face cloth that had been on his head, not lying with the other cloths, but folded and set apart by itself in a place of its own. The other disciple went in then, and he saw, and he believed. The text doesn't explain what exactly he believed or what moved through him in that moment of seeing. That's its own kind of testimony, the kind that can't be fully translated into argument. They went home. They did not know yet what the scriptures had said about this. They were carrying something they had no framework to hold. So they went home the way people go home when the world has shifted beneath them, and they need somewhere to stand. She turned, and there was someone standing there. It wasn't yet dawn enough to see clearly, and she thought it was the gardener. This detail has moved through centuries of reflection. The gardener, the one who tends the ground, who is responsible for what grows and what's buried and what comes back up. There's something almost too careful about this detail to be accidental. She thought it was the gardener. She asked him where the body had been laid. She said if he had carried it away, she would take it herself. She meant it, because that's the kind of love that doesn't know what to do with its hands but won't stop trying. He said her name, Mary, one word. Her name, spoken by the voice she knew before she knew what she was hearing. Everything that had accumulated in her since Friday, every hour of grief, every dark road, every moment of not knowing, broke open in the sound of her own name spoken back to her. She turned. Rabboni, she said, teacher. He told her not to hold on to him, that he hadn't yet ascended, that she must go and tell his brothers. Go to my brothers, he said. Say to them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. There's something given in that phrasing. The my and the your, the same Father, the same God, the distance closed in the very grammar of what he asked her to carry to them. She went. She didn't hesitate. She went back through the morning, back toward the city, back toward the room where the others were waiting in their fear and their confusion. She carried what she had received. She went and said to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." She told them what he had said to her. Those words, "I have seen the Lord," would travel outward from that morning in every direction. They haven't stopped traveling yet. That same evening, the first day of the week, the disciples were together, and the doors were locked because they were afraid. And then he was simply there among them, and none of them could have said afterward exactly how. No knock, no sound of a door opening. One moment, the room held only the 10 of them, their grief and their confusion, and the story Mary had brought back from the garden. And the next moment he was standing in the middle of them. "Peace be with you." That was the first thing he said. Not an explanation, not a rebuke for the locked door or the fear behind it. Peace. As though peace were the most natural thing to offer a group of men who had spent 3 days believing everything was over. He showed them his hands. He showed them his side. The marks were there. This wasn't a different person, not a vision, not the kind of story the mind tells itself when it wants something badly enough to invent it. This was the same body that had been taken down from the cross, the same wounds now present in a room with locked doors, and the disciples saw, and they were glad. They were glad. After the grief of the crucifixion and the bewilderment of the empty tomb, and the mourning that hadn't yet resolved into understanding, gladness came back into the room with him. It came in quietly, the way he did. He breathed on them. He said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." It was an act of extraordinary intimacy, the kind of thing that stays in the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives, not because it was dramatic, but because it was close. The breath of the living Christ, given to them in a room where they had been hiding, where they had locked the door against a world they no longer knew how to face. Thomas wasn't there. The others told him what had happened. "We've seen the Lord." And Thomas listened, and he didn't believe. His answer has been remembered across centuries as though it were a failure, but there's something honest in it that deserves to be held carefully. He wasn't the only one who had struggled. The others hadn't believed either until they saw. Thomas simply hadn't yet seen. His terms were direct. "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I won't believe." He wasn't asking for more than the others had already received. He was asking for the same thing, the seeing, the evidence of the hands and the side. 8 days passed. The disciples were inside again, and this time Thomas was with them, and the doors were locked again. And again he came and stood among them. "Peace be with you." The same greeting, the same presence arriving the same way, through a locked door into the middle of a room full of frightened people finding their way back towards something they didn't yet have words for. And he turned to Thomas. "Put your finger here. See my hands. Put out your hand and place it in my side. Don't disbelieve, but believe." There's no record that Thomas actually touched the wounds. What the text records is the response, "My Lord and my God." It's the fullest confession in the entire gospel. Cleaner than anything the disciples had said before, more complete. The man who had required evidence gave, in the end, the fullest articulation of faith. Thomas, who would not believe without seeing, became the one who said it most plainly, who named it most directly, who arrived at the declaration that the gospel had been building toward from its very first verse. Jesus received it. "Have you believed because you've seen me?" Then the words that reach beyond that room, beyond that evening, beyond the 8 days of Thomas's waiting in the locked doors, and the breath and the wounds shown in lamplight. "Blessed are those who haven't seen and yet have believed." And the words were meant for Thomas, yes, but they were also meant for everyone who would come after, for every person who would hear this story in the years and centuries ahead and have to decide what to do with it. After this, some of the disciples went back to the Sea of Tiberias, because they were fishermen, and the night was long, and they did not yet know what to do with themselves. And Peter said he was going fishing, and the others said they would go too. There were 7 of them: Thomas, and Nathanael, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others whose names the text doesn't record. They went out and got into the boat, and they fished through the night, and they caught nothing. This is worth sitting with for a moment. These were men who knew this water. They had spent years on it. They understood the currents and the depths and the places where the fish gathered. And still, through all the hours of darkness, nothing came up in the net. There's something in this detail that feels familiar to anyone who has ever worked hard at something and come up empty, who has returned to the thing they knew best and found that even that had gone quiet on them. The night passed. The water was dark and the sky above it was dark, and the net kept coming up the same way. And at some point the darkness began to change at the edges, and the shore became visible again as a pale line against the water. Dawn was arriving, and there was a figure on the shore. He called out to them across the water and asked whether they had any fish. They said no. He told them to cast the net on the right side of the boat, and they did. And the net filled so quickly and so completely that they couldn't haul it in. The weight of it pulled at the side of the boat. The beloved disciple was the first to understand. He said, "It is the Lord." Peter heard this and didn't wait. He pulled his outer garment around him and went into the water. The others stayed in the boat and brought the net in, dragging it slowly toward the shore, the fish pressing against one another inside it, the whole catch moving with them across the last 100 yards of water. When they came to land, they found a charcoal fire already burning, fish laid on it, bread beside it. Someone had prepared this before they arrived. The meal was already underway. It was a small fire, the kind that gives off warmth without much light, that smells of wood and of something cooking, that pulls people toward it without effort. And they stood around it in the early morning, still wet from the work of the night, and the world was very quiet. Jesus told them to bring some of what they had caught. Peter went back and dragged the net up onto the land. 153 fish. The number is recorded exactly, which suggests that someone counted, that the counting mattered, that the fullness of the net was itself something to be noted and remembered. The net, the text adds, wasn't torn. "Come and have breakfast," he said. And no one asked him who he was. They knew. They knew, and they couldn't quite speak it. The way there are moments when the truth is so present that putting it into words would somehow diminish it. They stood around the fire and they knew. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish as well. And this was now the 3rd time that he had appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. And they sat around the fire in the early morning and ate together. And the sea was still, and the day was just beginning. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And the question was simple, and it was not simple at all. There was a fire burning. That detail matters. When Peter had stood in the courtyard of the high priest on the night of the arrest, there had been a charcoal fire burning there too, and he had stood beside it warming himself. And it was beside that fire that he had said 3 times that he did not know the man. Now there was another fire, on a different shore, in the early morning, and the smell of it would have been the same, and Peter would have known what was happening. The question was not asked carelessly. Nothing in this gospel is done carelessly. Do you love me? Peter said, yes. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. The second time the question came, it was the same question, and Peter gave the same answer, and the commission was the same in its shape, though different in its words. Tend my sheep. There's a difference between a lamb and a sheep, between tending and feeding, and the repetition itself was doing something, working through something, each exchange laying down a new layer over the one that had cracked and broken in the firelit courtyard weeks before. The third time, the gospel says Peter was grieved. The word is exact, not confused, not defensive, grieved, because he understood by the third time what the pattern was, understood that this wasn't idle repetition, that Jesus was counting something, meeting something, that the three questions corresponded to three denials in a way that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be heard. Lord, he said, you know everything. You know that I love you. And it wasn't an argument. It was a confession, an acknowledgement that no protest or explanation was needed, that whatever Jesus already knew was sufficient, that the appeal was simply to that knowledge and to nothing else. Feed my sheep. Peter had denied him beside a fire, and now beside a fire he was given a flock. This is how restoration works in this gospel. Not through ceremony, not through a formal reinstatement or a public declaration, through the quiet repetition of a question and an answer, until the answer has been given as many times as the denial, until the record, if there's a record, has been amended. There's mercy in the structure of it. The structure itself is the mercy. He told Peter, after this, something about the years ahead, about what age would bring, about a time when others would lead him where he didn't want to go. He said it to indicate, the text tells us, the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said what he had said at the beginning, beside another sea, on an ordinary morning before any of this had begun. Follow me. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, and he asked about him. What about this man? What will happen to him? And the question was perhaps understandable, perhaps very human, the desire to know how someone else's story would go, to compare, to measure. But the answer wasn't an answer to that question. If it's my will that he remain until I come, what's that to you? What is that to you? He said. You follow me, and that was all, and it was enough, and Peter got up and followed. The story is complete now. And the morning has come, and the sea lies still outside the city, and the fire on the shore has burned down to coals, and the disciples are resting, and you can rest too. He came first to a wedding. That detail has always carried a particular warmth. Of all the places the Word made flesh might have first shown his hand, it was at a celebration, among people who had run out of wine. Among the ordinary embarrassments and small joys of a life being lived. He turned the water into wine, and it was the best wine, and most of the people there didn't know where it had come from. That's how it began. He sat beside a well in the heat of the day and spoke to a woman who had come alone at the wrong hour and told her things about herself that a stranger should not have known. And she left her water jar and went back to her city and said, Come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Come and see. Those words spread the way such words always spread, from one person to another, carried in the ordinary channels of human speech. He stood outside a tomb and wept. He called a man who had been dead 4 days back out into the light by name, And the man came. He walked into Jerusalem, and the crowd laid branches in the road and called out, "Hosanna," which is an old word, a word that means "save us," and it was the right word, even if the crowd didn't fully understand why. He knelt on the floor of an upper room and washed the feet of men who weren't sure what to do with what they were watching. He prayed in a garden. He stood before a governor who asked, "What is truth?" and did not answer, because the answer was standing in front of him. He said, "It is finished," and bowed his head. He was laid in a garden tomb, and the stone was rolled across, and the world went quiet. And then it was still dark, and a woman came to the tomb, and the stone was gone, and everything that followed from that morning is still following. The net full of fish, the fire on the shore, the bread given and the fish given, and the disciples sitting in the early light, not quite believing what they were part of. The question asked 3 times beside the warmth of the coals, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And each time, yes, and each time a charge given, and a man restored, and the morning continuing on around all of it. The moment stretched long enough for understanding to settle in. Peter knew what was being asked. Not just a simple question about affection, but about the foundation of everything that would come next. The other disciples watched from where they stood, witnesses to what was being restored. There was no anger in the voice, only infinite patience, only a restoration offered and received in the presence of the sea and the breaking day. This was how it would all begin again. The fire has burned low now. The voices have quieted. There's nothing left to do tonight but let the story settle into you the way warmth settles into tired hands held near a flame. You don't need to hold it. It will hold. The sea outside the city is flat and gray in the early light. The shore is empty. The coals are orange and fading. The disciples are somewhere nearby, sleeping, their nets drying on the bank. The morning comes in slowly over the water. There's no wind. The shore, the coals, the water, the sea is still. The morning is here. The story has been told. Sleep well.